Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who is tired of the gridlock and vitriol in Washington and feels like a new major party is needed, welcome home, my purple people. Now, I want to start off the episode by throwing out a few numbers to you. Right now, over 70% of Americans support raising the federal minimum wage. 70% favor stronger action to counter the effects of climate change, and almost 60% support Medicare for all. Yet the party that has none of the above on their platform won the White House in both chambers in November. So how do we explain this political pineapple on pizza, folks? Well, a survey done by Echelon Insights earlier this year offers us some ideas. We're going to talk about that and what that says about our political system on the whole. But first, actually, before we get to the but first, Shawn, I have to ask you, pineapple on pizza, how do you feel about that?
It's not my preferred thing, but
Yeah.
I don't judge anyone who gets it if they want pineapple on their pizza. Now, if they do that, then there has to be like Canadian bacon on it or something. Like
Yes.
You can't just have pineapple and cheese. That's kind of gross. Like you have to have something a bit salty
Yes.
to go with it.
I totally agree with you. I think I was trying to figure out an odd mix metaphor. I thought of kettle corn, but most people like kettle corn. Platypus, kind of an odd mix, and then I landed on pineapple on pizza. So that's where we are, in case you were wondering. So now the real but first. Our favorite American political figure, Matt Gaetz, is now on Cameo. And for those of you who aren't aware of what that is, I'm guessing you're listening to a podcast, so you're probably aware of what it is, but it's an app where you can pay celebrities to deliver a customized greeting to whoever you want, birthday greeting, anniversary, what have you. So yeah.
It kind of feels like par for the course for how this year has gone. Although astoundingly, like his videos start at like $500 from what I read, and I'm like, a lot of the people who got behind the whole MAGA thing and Trump thing and his side of things were talking about the price of eggs, and he wants to charge $500 for a minute and a half video. So
that's the Biden economy, Shawn. Cameo inflation.
Right.
It's almost like the lounge circuit for ex-Trump world folks. Like you had Roger Stone on there. I know Corey Lewandowski was there for a while. Sarah Palin is on there. It's exclusively the domain of the right.
Well, I can't imagine anyone on the left hiring Joe Biden to do a cameo. And yeah, I don't know a single Democrat who would pay anyone, not even AOC probably, to do a cameo. Maybe AOC. I don't know.
Maybe AOC. I'll tell you this. And we're going to talk about the wave of Republican victories in a little bit. And I will tell you, their domination of Cameo probably has as much to do with the fact that the entertainment value of your typical modern day Republican is so far ahead of the entertainment value of any Democrat out there. Step it up, Team Blue.
Well, and I think the reason why is because, for all the talk that Kamala Harris had about embracing the next generation of leadership, the Democratic Party hasn't done that. And you and I, we've talked about the strengths of the parties as institutions. And we both believe the Democratic Party is the stronger institution of between the two parties. But the Republican Party has kind of more embraced the younger generation, I think, more than the Democrats.
I think they have. And there's some stuff I want to save for the end of this conversation that's going to touch back on that, because I feel like it's important to bring the listener up to speed on what you and I have been chatting about privately. So this conversation is going to be based largely around work done by Echelon Insights. Every year they release a report called Political Quadrants that breaks down where the American electorate stands. And what I really like about them is they don't break down the electorate in terms of political party. They break it down in terms of ideological lean. And they base it on two criteria, one being how conservative or liberal are you economically, but also how conservative or liberal are you socially as well. And they break down the electorate into four distinct groups. And on opposite sides of those quadrants are progressives and conservatives, who, as you might imagine, are traditionally Democratic or Republican voters. So conservatives comprise, I think at the last survey, about 35% of all voters, progressives, 41%. So large amounts, not enough to win an election. Now, then we have these kind of two oddball quadrants. The first are people who are socially liberal, fiscally conservatives. Echelon Insights refers to them as libertarians. They're like 5%, 4 or 5% of the electorate. But then there's another group who are economically liberal and socially conservative that they refer to as the populists. And these people are about 20% of the electorate in total. And this is the group that both parties are fighting over right now. Now, the interesting thing about the populists, these are people who align with the economic message of the Democratic Party, but they also align with the cultural message of the Republican Party. And so there's, again, getting back to pineapple on pizza, Shawn, they're this odd mix of ideologies that ultimately have determined the past few elections.
It's interesting to me because I don't typically hear about people who are economically liberal and socially conservative. Usually it's, they're economically conservative or it's socially liberal. That's for me, when I meet anyone who's sort of a mixed bag of political ideas, that's typically how it falls.
Yeah.
So to hear that this makes up about 20% of the electorate is a bit surprising to me, but it also, to me, points to how difficult it could be to campaign to these
Mm-hmm.
type of people, especially when you don't want to anger your own base of support. But then you have to figure out this, to use your metaphor, you have to figure out how exactly do you sell pineapple on pizza to people who both like it and don't like it. So.
Yes. So yeah, so that was interesting to me as well, because I am like you. I know a lot of folks who are fiscally conservative, socially liberal. I think it might be an effect of where we live.
Hmm.
The reality is, like, you and I both live in densely populated urban areas where you've
Hmm.
got a high concentration of liberals, and the, quote unquote conservatives you're going to get are more likely going to be skeptical of, big government, skeptical of the power of government to meaningfully affect people's lives, but all the same are going to be very socially liberal just by virtue of the people you're living around. Now, the interesting thing about the populists is that these are people who have their own sort of unique geographic distribution and their own sort of media bubble, if you will. Although it's kind of tough to call it that, and we'll get into that in a bit. But the interesting thing is, so if you talk about conservatives or you talk about progressives, these groups are largely dominant in either rural or urban regions. Obviously, rural being more conservative, progressives being more urban. Populists are kind of all over the place. So not so much in the urban areas, so a smaller percentage, under 20%, but pretty much split evenly between rural and suburban, right? They're not necessarily concentrated in one geographic region. Part two is, as you might imagine, they tend to be more working class. So large percentage, about 70% non-college, educated, mixed in terms of religious affiliation, and top concerns are largely economic, right? So the big things they support are economic interventions in government, job protection, trade restrictions. I think this is where Trump wins. But the interesting thing here, and I just want to note something, is you hear a lot of people on the left say, why are people voting against their interests? Why is it that somebody who is working class, who is non-college educated, why are they voting for a party that is all about dismantling the federal government, all about lowering benefits, all about lowering job protections? And this brings me to the other thing that really sticks out about them, which is they are much more likely to be distrustful of government and institutions than any other of the quadrants. They are the most skeptical
Hmm.
in the government's power to improve their lot. And so I think when you look at it through that lens, it makes perfect sense, which is you have a group of people who are being sold the idea from one party that if they're in power, they're going to implement all these programs that are going to cure their ills. And yet they're highly skeptical in the institution that this party is going to use to enact these programs. I think another kind of paternalistic idea that floats out there is that this suspicion has not been well earned, or this suspicion is the result of partisan media and social media and so on. But if you look at history, you'll see a series of successive failures on the part of the Democratic Party when it comes to servicing the working class voters that used to comprise their base, the union voters that used to comprise their base. I mean, I'll always start in 1992 when Ross Perot ran as an independent on a platform that was really pretty much like Trump's platform without the race baiting, right?
Hmm.
He was
Hmm.
talking about lowering the national debt. He was talking suspiciously about global trade agreements and what that would do to American jobs. And Bill Clinton ran primarily on the strength of the relationship that the Democratic Party had with the unions. Now, lo and behold, 30 years later, most of what Ross Perot said was right. And the unions figured that out, right? And so it's not a big surprise to me why these people are suspicious of government. And it's not a big surprise to me as to why these people have lost faith in the Democratic Party.
Right. I mean, they're looking at a government that hasn't served their interest in a long time, and when you look at some of the policies they support, and some of them are popular policies like raising the minimum wage and things like that, the Democrats aren't speaking to those things. I mean, Kamala Harris had to make her entire campaign about referendum on Trump. So she didn't speak to the economic woes from working class Americans. She didn't speak to those needs from the union workers. And that's probably the biggest reason why there was a lot of unions that either refused to back anyone or who decided to in the end back Trump. But I think where this is most noticeable is even though the populists are kind of spread out, they're not in any particular area based on where they're mostly, which is the rural and suburban areas. You can look at states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that neither party was able to get a majority in the presidential race
Yep.
in those states, it says a lot. It says that the Democratic Party wasn't able to speak to the economic needs of these voters, but also they weren't entirely sold on Trump either.
It was interesting. So AOC noticed that in her district, there were a subset of people who cast ballots for Trump and her. And so she put out a call on social media saying, hey, if you're one of those voters, I want to talk to you. I want to find out exactly why. And the things that came out of that exercise were that they liked the fact that both AOC and Trump were anti establishment, number one. And they also had a sense that both of them were fighting for the working class. They didn't get
Mhm.
specific with it, but in my mind, really what this tells me is that most people equate anti-establishment sentiments with fighting for them, or most people in this populist quadrant equate that. And this kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with Cameo, and something I wanted to get back to, which is the thing that ties Trump and AOC together is the fact that they are both media presences
Mhm.
almost above and beyond being politicians,
Yeah.
right? AOC's social media presence preceded her into
Mhm.
Congress. She came in a social media star. Same thing as
Sh
Donald Trump.
Yeah, they both have brands.
That's exactly it. And I
Yeah.
do feel like we are entering a new era where politicians are brands in and of themselves. And just like you couldn't poo poo TV back during the dawn of television, you can't poo poo social media and the digital media channels that ultimately help people feel like they have some authentic tie with political figures. And this isn't just restricted to AOC and Trump. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene to a lesser extent. Jeff Jackson in North Carolina, he was a representative, Democratic representative, recently gerrymandered out of existence. Now the state's attorney general. He had built an enormous following on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problems this presents, and we talked about this before, is the fact that this really weakens the parties, but it also takes a huge emphasis off of policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the big question is how do we rectify that?
Right. Well, to speak to what you were saying a little bit about building those personalities, you kind of wonder if now that's why, along with sort of the type of people who ended up supporting Trump in this election, but why Trump has suggested that he would try and do what he could to reverse the TikTok ban. It's
Yeah.
because he sees that as a platform for not only getting his brand across, but preserving it even
Mm-hmm.
beyond to other individuals who might follow in his stead, and those type of politicians that he would like to be, the future kingmaker of.
Yeah.
So you kind of wonder.
The other thing I want to state too is a lot of people are going to hear that and they're going to lament the fact that politics has been quote unquote reduced to, mean tweets and dank memes and whatnot, right? And the thing I'd like to remind anyone who's feeling that way, number one, of course, there was the same thing happened when politics came on television. Same thing happened when politics came on radio, right?
Hmm.
There was this feeling that American politics was above that medium. That was disproven. The second thing I think I want to go back to is something I said earlier about the plight of the populace, which is what you have is you have an island of people who were basically stuck with a party that didn't serve them because the only alternative was a party that was working actively against them,
Hmm.
right? And this is the problem that we have in the two-party system. In the case of unions, they were a reliable Democratic vote. The Democrats could take them for granted because the Republicans were explicitly anti-union, right? And there gets to be a point where things get bad enough where it just doesn't matter anymore. And I think that's what we saw in 2016. This is something political scientist Lee Drutman talks a lot about. Once a population or a subset of the American population is won by a particular party, the other party doesn't have to compete for them anymore. And so the other party can actively campaign against their interests while the party that they're voting for can ignore them.
Hmm.
And I mean, we could say the same thing about the Arab American vote in Michigan this time around, which you could argue cost Harris at least the state, not the
Hmm.
election, but definitely the state. And I think this makes a very strong case for electoral systems that offer a little more fluidity when it comes to the ability to build coalitions. Because I think
Yeah.
right now, again, with the Coke versus Pepsi option, your option is like, well, I can go with the party that says they like me, but hasn't really done anything to benefit me, or I can suck it. And that's kind of it. Those are my two options right there. But I think systems that allow these subpopulations to fluidly form coalitions and fluidly move between different parties would not only give them somebody to vote for, but could potentially head these problems off before they become critical, as they are now.
No, no, and I agree. I think the two-party system was designed to kind of build up two large brands. But again, one of the dangers of a pure democracy that Hamilton and Madison spoke to in the Federalist Papers was that at some point the population is going to get so large that you are going to cease to be able to represent everybody, and the temptation is going to be to represent your own interests, which is why they wanted to adopt both a constitutional republic and a democracy under the umbrella of federalism. But what you're seeing is that very danger of democracy rear itself up by the brands of the two major parties in a system that gives people, hey, you only have these two options. And if one side isn't serving your interest, then your only other option is the other party. And and unfortunately, it's just I think it checks a lot of people out. I think that maybe one of the biggest things that's not talked about is just the drop in turnout this time around
Mm-hmm.
compared to 2020. Just people I mean, they looked at their options and they were like, well, I'm just tired of both Coke and Pepsi, and
Yeah.
and neither one is altering their business practices to that better fit my interests, especially since I don't feel better off today than I was 4 years ago. And 4 years ago was in the middle of a pandemic.
Well, I think you make a really good point there. My biggest fear has been that turnout eventually is going to drop, right? Interestingly enough, you look at the last like 30 years of presidential politics, turnout's been pretty resilient against what we could argue have been some pretty dismal choices, especially like in recent election cycles. I'm beginning to wonder how long that holds out.
Yeah.
And I do think, getting back to the whole to what we were talking about earlier about this sort of cultural alignment versus economic alignment in the parties, I think what we're seeing is the parties are more cultural brands than they are economic ones,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm not somebody who believes the government is there to be culturally validating. I do believe it's there to uphold human rights. So
Right.
if we take a fairly benign issue like the civil rights movement, I think the government's role is to step in when people's civil rights are being violated. But that's where it ends,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think what I fear is that people have given up on the government being able to meaningfully impact their lives. And so instead what they'll go for is the candidate they feel best represents them culturally.
I mean, you can kind of see that in the Trump campaign strategy by tying everything to immigration.
Yeah.
All your economic woes, every problem in this country, whether or not there's any truth to what he was talking about,
Yep.
and a lot of times he did lie, but it was a way for him to connect the economic populism of, I'm here to fight for the working class
Hmm.
with a cultural issue, because he understood that the populists weren't entirely on board with his economic plans, but they were on the cultural side of what he was arguing for.
Yep. 100%. Now, here's an interesting thing. So I was looking at all this and I was trying to figure out, okay, so what's the best way to meaningfully impact this? I think we talked about this earlier, which is I think it will be near impossible to implement any federal solution to this problem. I think there are just too many vested interests in Washington, too little gets done. And
Mhm.
so what I started taking a look into were some of the movements of the progressive era to try and figure out kind of how they ultimately went about implementing reform. The two biggest reforms out there, which we've talked about before, are the direct election of senators and women's suffrage, right?
Mhm.
And now the interesting thing is that in both cases, these were actually state by state movements. So there wasn't any big federal push. What happened is Oregon was the first state to directly elect senators or allow voters to elect senators. Prior to that, it was picked by members of state government. Nebraska was number two a few years later. And within 4 years of Oregon being the first state to directly elect senators, you had 28 states that had some form of Senate election. And then, of
Mhm.
course, 1913, almost 10 years later, 17th Amendment is passed. Same thing happens with women's suffrage, takes a little bit longer, but same thing. Over the course of time, more and more states adopted the system. Eventually, there was a constitutional amendment. Now, I think when it comes to the system that can best address the problem we're talking about, which is, allowing these subsets of the American electorate to ally themselves fluidly with other groups. I know we talk a lot about top four and top five. I'm still a big fan of that, but I don't think
Mhm.
that's the solution. You can disagree with me if you want. I legitimately think you need true mixed member proportional representation, true multi-party system, not a duopoly, but we're talking like 4 or 5 parties. I think we
Mhm.
need that in order to truly solve the problem.
I think when you look at the state of where nonpartisan reform is right now, particularly when it comes to election reform, there's a lot of reformers who are looking at what is the solution that we can get passed. What is it that voters are going to get behind, and what are they going to support, and will it lead to more meaningful representation? And so, right now, You're seeing this big push for the top four, top five primaries with ranked choice voting in the general election or in both the primary and the general election, which is a way, as research has shown, to get candidates away from the extremes and pull them more towards the center to have a more mixed bag of policy positions, or to at least not be so ideologically rigid that they aren't willing to work with the other side. I think if you're able to have sort of a proportional system where you have these smaller factions that can create coalitions, and you actually incentivize that by having that type of system, there is some perceived benefit to that. The problem is twofold. One, the people in power are definitely going to push back on that.
Mhm.
Is and that's really the roadblock that nonpartisan reformers are running into right now. Just trying to get the nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting passed is the powers that be pushing against it. But also, it's the ability to sell it to voters without getting too technical about it.
Yes.
Because when you even the phrase multi-district proportional representation is such a boring such a boring phrase to
Oh
use.
yeah.
That in itself, like, then you have to explain that. You have to explain how that works. I mean, as much as opponents of ranked choice voting like to say that ranked choice voting is complicated, imagine having to explain multi-district proportional representation to voters and exactly how that would work and how it ensures that they are actually represented in whatever legislative body we're talking about.
Yes. For those who are unfamiliar with what we're talking about, we'll clue you in. In multi-member proportional representation, you replace the single-member district, which is what we use now, with a multi-member district. So instead of living in a district with one representative, you've got, let's say, three. And the seats are awarded in proportion to a party share of the popular vote. So let's say you live in a district that's 60% Democrat and 40% Republican. Well, instead of having one Democratic representative, you have two Democratic representatives and one Republican. So it's much harder to gerrymander. It much more evenly represents the electorate. And it also allows more room for smaller parties to flourish. Again, the problem, to your point, Shawn, is trying to explain that to people before they fall asleep
Hmm.
is a Herculean task. And getting back to the way these reforms were implemented prior, there are movements right now to implement it strictly at the state level. So California, for example, has the Prop Rep Coalition, and they're looking to turn the California state legislature into one that is determined by proportional representation. Right? I think if you could get people to adopt that at the state level, that would make them more comfortable with the idea of doing it at a federal congressional level. But again, you've also got to rely on people voting in state elections, which is
The other important thing about any social movement that's happened in this country and been successful is that it does start with a grassroots
yeah,
effort. It starts with a bottom up approach where you have people who are willing to go door to door, willing to demonstrate, willing to hold protests. I mean, every single major movement that you've talked about, particularly when it comes to like women's suffrage, and I know we didn't talk about, but this, like the civil rights movement, a major factor in that was grandiose demonstrations that caught people's attention. And so I don't necessarily think you need that, but you do need that grassroots support. You need
yeah.
to be able to build up you need that sort of on the ground effort to pass in the state level.
Let me ask you this question, because
Yeah.
this is something I've been thinking about. So, if we take any subpopulation that's kind of turned against their party over the last couple election cycles, and it's really mainly the Democrats who are kind of shedding people, but let's take like the Arab American community or the populists, right,
Hmm.
the working class union voters who ultimately flip Republican. One of my concerns, I think, about something like top four or ranked choice voting is that it's almost too consensus driven. So these subpopulations might be paved over in
Hmm.
that process. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I definitely like. I think if there's one area that has consistently been something that the reform movement needs to work on, it is reaching out to underrepresented groups,
Hmm.
whether it is the Arab American population, whether it's the Black population, whether it's any group that is historically been marginalized within our country. And you heard this from one of the attacks on the sponsor of open primaries and RCV in DC is that that she was trying to advocate for a movement that is too white, and that is a valid and genuine concern that there is not enough diversity and there's not enough efforts to reach out to these communities to better educate them and show them exactly how they can benefit from reform to the system.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hate to like stick up for first past the post, but I will say if I'm a minority group, I definitely have more political power if me just not showing up to the polls can tilt an election.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, again, the Arab American community has pretty much made themselves clear to the Democrats. I think the Democrats were under the impression that, you know, okay, we may not be catering to them, but they're not going to vote for Trump. Oh, big mistake. They made it loud and clear they would rather see Trump in office than elect a Democratic party that just pays lip service to their concerns. And, you know, I think they also need to pay attention to the fact that Harris underperformed her own party.
Hmm.
You know, again, AOC, prime example. Trump voters voted for AOC. Trump voters voted for other Democratic candidates across the board.
Yeah.
And I think getting back to something we said earlier, I think people want authenticity. I think people want connection. I think people want somebody who's going to buck the system.
And what I'm going to say on the Republican side, we talked about David Valadao,
Yeah.
right? We've talked about him in California in the 22nd district, where it's a D+10 district, and he's able to win. And the reason he's able to win is not only is he not extreme, but he's on a first name basis with a lot of voters.
Yes.
Like he's built that connection, the very connection you said that candidates need to with these voters, individual voters.
Hmm.
Because Valadao, he didn't just win Republicans, he didn't just win independents, he won moderate Democrats too, who and maybe even some progressive Democrats who were just happy with his representation.
Yeah. You know, we can't fight the fact that politics is going to become more celebrity driven. We
Hmm.
can't fight the fact that people are going to want and gravitate towards candidates with a let's burn it down approach, right? And what we want to make sure is that people who are running for office don't go full bore in that direction. Because even though it's what people say they want, when put into action, we already know it's not what people want,
Right.
right? People already went through 4 years of Trump and they voted him out.
Well, there's immediate buyer's remorse, and it's the very reason why you're seeing this unprecedented thing where more and more we may see one-term presidents. If this is how candidates continue to run campaigns, we may see continuous flips of
Hmm.
the White House every 4 years rather than every 8 years as it used to be with the occasional one-term president, right?
Yeah.
And now it's going to become the norm.
Yeah. You know, you talk about skepticism of the federal government. Well, that's not going to improve if a party can never stay in power long enough to enact their policies.
Right.
And with a narrowly divided Congress and with a White House that is constantly switching parties and is governing pretty much by executive order, they're
Mhm.
not going to see any of that change.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, at this point you have a situation where Congress is so deadlocked and you can't get anything through, that the executive branch is doing everything they can to skirt Congress and get their policies. But what happens is that Trump will put in executive orders that then Biden will erase
Yeah.
and put in his own executive orders that then now Trump will get in office and do away with and put in his own stuff. So it's just, yeah, it's not a way to build confidence in an institution when that institution is constantly in a state of back and forth flux that nothing gets done. It's just a constant fight between two sides.
Yep. And I think that, getting back to the populists, getting back to the people who are really the deciding factors in these elections, what is needed to bring them back is effective government. Like, what's needed to bring them back is the idea that their concerns will be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think until we remedy that, until we have a system that incentivizes more David Valadeos and less cameo bound congressional firebrands,
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll be in this situation. I think we're going to end it there, Shawn. I think we're going to end it there. So thank you very much for joining us. If you liked today's episode, be sure to rate it. Be sure to write a review. Be sure to subscribe, and be sure to share this with anyone you think might like to hear it too. Theme music courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you very much for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.